everyone. My name is Natalie Kirby. It's my pleasure to welcome you to
CJF J-Talk of the season, and I can't imagine a more perfect setting. We have a roaring fire and we have couches. I'm thrilled to have you here this evening. Being at Massey College is incredibly meaningful to us at the CJF. I'm proud to be a member of this community as a senior fellow, and each year at our CJF annual awards, we present the William Southam Journalism Fellows, giving a national stage to these prestigious fellowships, and we've been doing this for more than 2 decades. So our thanks to Massey College for hosting us this evening and for their ongoing partnership. I also want to thank TD Bank Group, our J-Talk season sponsor. Their support makes it possible to bring these talks to you throughout the year, from the explosion of women's sports coverage to AI's impact on democracy, from protecting inclusive journalism to combating misinformation. These are the conversations that matter to the future of journalism in Canada, and we could not do that without TD's support. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land on which we gather. Massey College is situated on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. For thousands of years, this land has been cared for by Indigenous peoples who have passed down their histories, knowledge, and stories from generation to generation. It continues to be home to communities from across Turtle Island, and we acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards this land and the great privilege we have to gather here. As we celebrate the launch of We Survived the Night, Julian Brave NoiseCat's memoir, we're reminded of the power of story to illuminate experience, foster understanding, and honor resilience. Many of you may know Julian from his award-winning journalism in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. But what makes tonight especially meaningful for us at the CJF is that Julian was a CJF, CBC, Indigenous Journalism Fellow back in 2017. And since then, we have had the privilege to watch his career take flight. He's gone on to do award-winning magazine writing, win the 2022 American Mosaic Journalism Prize, land on the Time 100 Next list, and in 2024 earn an Academy Award nomination for Sugarcane, the powerful documentary he co-directed. The film also won the Sundance Directing Award for U.S. Documentary and went on to collect 40 more awards. A proud member of the Canim Lake Band, Julian is also a champion powwow dancer. His prize winnings once included a horse. He's also an avid hockey player, and before turning to journalism and filmmaking, a political strategist, policy analyst, and cultural organizer. We Survived the Night, his first book, was published last month by Penguin Random House, and we're thrilled to have it available for you here this evening. On behalf of the CJF and the entire audience, it is my honor and privilege to welcome Julian Brave NoiseCat.
This is the suitcase that I was lugging around while we were chasing an Academy Award with Sugarcane. We have Harvey Weinstein to thank for the existence of this thing called an Oscars campaign. I turned it into an art piece called Coyote's Son's Spaceship, which I promise will make sense once you read the book, okay? So here goes. This is the Constitution song from Mount Currie, composed during a prior constitutional crisis on this continent, and it's a lot more powerful when you choose to sing along. A couple weeks back in Brooklyn, they were a little too chicken shit to sing, but I assume here in Toronto, it's not the case. So once you get the tune, you have to sing. Okay, here goes. Canada is all Indian land, oh Canada. awesome. We can go home now. No, so, they say you should never judge a book by its cover. But tonight, here at Massey College, I'm going to make the case that you could, maybe even should, judge my first book, We Survived the Night, by this cover. This artwork is called Coyote Sees the World Clearly by Jean Quick-to-See Smith. Now, Jean Quick-to-See Smith was one of the most significant American painters of the last century. Most would qualify that and say that Jean was one of the most significant Native American painters of the last century. But I'm going to take things a step further because if you can't tell, I cannot help myself. And I'm going to say that Jean is one of the most significant painters of the last century. And I'm going to say that in part because Jean was one of the most significant artists to ever represent this guy right here, the trickster coyote. One of the most significant figures in North American culture, and dare I say, history and current affairs. Indigenous peoples all the way from Central America to Western Canada used to tell stories about the trickster coyote, including Jean's people, the Salish, from what is now Montana, and my people, the Secwépemc and St'at'imc, from what is now British Columbia. You see, 5,000 years ago, according to linguists, archaeologists, and our own oral history, Jean's people and my people used to be one people. In fact, before colonization, sometimes we referred to ourselves as coyote people, by which we meant that we understood ourselves and our history through stories about the trickster coyote, who was sent to the earth by the Creator to set things in order, but was a trickster. And so while he did some good, he was often up to no good. So after filling the rivers with salmon and populating the lands with descendants, he turned around and used those fish to try to marry into every single native village along the river that would have him because he was a bit of a womanizer. And after having all those kids, he abandoned us because Coyote was probably the most epic, deadbeat dad ever known to human history. And every single story about this guy, Coyote, he was an example to our children of how not to be. And yet, we considered him second only to the Creator himself in our account of creation, an embodiment of the contradictions inherent to our own human nature, a representation of the paradoxes that drive and ride the metamorphoses of this world. And so when I was thinking about whose artwork I wanted to use on the cover of my first book, Jean Quick-to-See Smith was the first person who came to mind. In Indian country, we often say that we're all related, by which we mean that we can all find common connection. But the thing about being related is that it means that we all have history. So when I was thinking about how I could reach Jean Quick-to-See Smith, my long-lost Salish auntie, I reached out to another auntie named in this book in the Indian way rather than the biological one. Her name's Janine Antoine. Janine's married to a guy named Dick Trudell, who Ted Kennedy, the former United States Senator, used to call the king of the Indians. That's a direct quote. Janine used to run a gallery in San Francisco where my own father used to show his art, and her personal collection of native artwork would prove to you that she can reach just about any artist across this continent. And so when I was trying to reach Jean Quick-to-See Smith, I asked Janine, hey, can you get me to Auntie Jean? And Janine was like, remember, we're all related, we all have history. Janine said, I'll give you her number, but you cannot, under any circumstances, use my name. So I reached out to Jean Quick-to-See Smith, saying Janine's name. The very next day, Jean got back to me and said, of course you can use Coyote Sees the World Clearly on the cover of your first book. Just send 2 copies to my Family Foundation library. So I told my publisher to double it because 4 is a sacred number in my people's culture, and I was on my way. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that requires a little additional setup. In my work, I'm breaking the rules of nonfiction. You're not supposed to have tricksters, the supernatural, mythic ancestors, the beyond involved in the events of the here and now. That's supposed to be off limits, but it's true. And I say that because 3 weeks after Jean Quick-to-See Smith gave me her personal permission to use Coyote Sees the World Clearly on the cover of We Survived the Night. She died. To the best of my knowledge, this cover is the last thing Jean personally permissioned while she was still here with us. Earlier this year, I found myself in New York City on the first Thursday of the month, so I wandered down to the gallery district to catch a show by an up-and-coming native painter named Jordan and Craig. And as I was walking out that show, I turned left, and I looked to my left. And what was on at the Garth Green Gallery but a retrospective by none other than Jean Quick-to-See Smith. So of course I walked in. And what was I greeted by? Not one, but two artworks representing the trickster coyote himself. A big painting on the back wall, the biggest one in the show, and a big statue, the only sculpture in the entire gallery, because if I know one thing about that trickster coyote, he is not going to settle for one piece of artwork in his honor. No, he needs at least two. So as I was taking in this coyote story, this New York moment that I had wandered into, I thought to myself, I gotta tell somebody the truth about this scene. And so I cased the room, and I identified the guy who looked like he probably owned the place, and I walked up to him and I said, hey, you don't know me, I don't know you, but this is who I am and how I'm related to Jean Quick-to-See Smith and her artwork. And of course I had profiled the guy correctly. He was in fact the gallery owner. And after I finished my story, he said, wow, you are crazy. Before Jean died, she used to joke that she was going to visit me from the beyond. So here is what I am saying with my work. Now here in fact is what I am insisting, that our people's approach to stories, to what we have always considered to be nonfiction on this land, which was ours for thousands and 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 thousands of years before it was the United States, before it was Canada. You all said so yourselves. Still gets at the truth about how stories unfold in our lives and on this land. Kukshetchel, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with writer, journalist, filmmaker, I mean the list goes on, who I deeply admire, someone who's shown the path for many of us in those art forms, whether we're Indigenous or not, Tanya Talaga. This has been a special oral chapter from We Survived the Night, a coyote story performed the old-fashioned way before this little blip in literacy that, you know, looks like it's gonna die off maybe. And I call it Cover Story. Thank you.
Okay, the good news is that is just the first portion of our program. I have another very special introduction of an absolute powerhouse in journalism, and that is the remarkable Tanya Talaga. Tanya, as Julian said, she's an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, documentary filmmaker, and her work has been essential in bringing Indigenous perspectives and truths to the forefront of Canadian journalism. But I also want to tell you about Tanya's remarkable generosity to the CJF, our organization. She has reviewed and poured over every Indigenous program and initiative we have launched. Tanya has sat on our selection committees. She's helped recruit Indigenous talent to our journalism programs, and she has been an invaluable champion, friend, and advisor to our organization. Last year, we were absolutely thrilled to honor her with the CJF Tribute, our highest award recognizing her unwavering commitment to Indigenous storytelling and her profound impact on journalism. Everyone, let's welcome Tanya Talaga.
coming, and you're so lucky I don't sing. I only sing in the lodge. I sing so badly, in fact. When we were doing the documentary The Knowing, we had to cut it out. Like, I am seriously without any tune whatsoever. But enough about that. I'm so thrilled to be here with you. You know, I don't think I can say, words can't express how proud I am of you. All the work you do, all the things you've done, and I have known Julian since he was a student at Columbia. I don't know if you remember that, but you called me and you interviewed me for a piece you were doing on Indigenous journalism, covering the apocalypse.
Oh yeah, no, it was for the Columbia Journalism Review.
That's
yeah.
right.
I had graduated at that point.
Had you
Yeah,
graduated?
yeah,
Oh my God,
I remember.
you're still
I remember
one.
that.
I mean, but you're always going to be young.
Listen, if you want to make me younger, I'm down. At this point, I'm trying to be younger.
But you know, I learned a lot in that talk, and I remember I sat in my driveway. It was during COVID, wasn't it? It was just,
Yes.
yeah, I sat in my driveway and I was like in my car for, I think we talked for like 2 hours. Anyway.
Wow, I took 2 hours of your time. That was very
No,
generous.
it was great. I didn't have to go inside and see my children during COVID. No, it was amazing. Because you opened my eyes to some things I never thought of, and that actually helped my writing so much. And for that, I'm always grateful.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you've opened all of our eyes to so much, so, you know, it goes reciprocity, I think is what they call that.
And so, though, when I was asked by Natalie, she said, what do you do? So I'm like, of course, I'm going to do this because I am I'm one of your biggest anti-fans, I gotta say. This book, I have notes. Yeah, I'm so old-fashioned. The AI bots are really going to take me down. This book is so beautiful. You can't leave here without buying this book and reading this book. It is so heartfelt. There is so much in you in this book. I feel like I know you so much more. I'm sure everyone who reads this book will feel the same. Sometimes it's a gut punch. And sometimes I was laughing out loud because we're funny. We are. We're really funny. That's how we cope. And sometimes I cried. You know, we all share parts of the same story. I say that all the time because I really believe that to be true. If you are a First Nations person in this country, in America, medicine line doesn't matter. I mean, none of it matters really. We all share parts of colonial oppression, assimilation, horrible things done to our families, children ripped away from us, and we live with the after effects. We are the survivors of intergenerational trauma in so many ways. And so that's me saying you have to read this book. The journalism in this book, too, is fantastic. It is not just, like, people try and define our work, I think, sometimes. Memoir, journalism. But I think as First Nations writers, we do something different. We write in a different way that sees the future, and it sees the past, and it sees the present, all at the same time. This is not my notes when I asked you this question, because sometimes you find your book in the most rando shelves in a bookstore, because they don't know how to define us. Have you done that yet? Have you walked into a bookstore and found it like in the, I don't know, the gardening aisle, or?
I literally am just hoping that they have it when I walk in. I'm in a very different spot with this. I walk into the bookstore and I'm like, do they have it? Is it in here? Like, I'm just trying to find it.
Has your mom done this yet? This is what my mom does. My mom goes into bookstores and she gets it. It's like if she finds my book in the community, sometimes it's in the community and culture aisle, which is usually at the back of the bookstore on a bottom shelf somewhere. My mom will haul the books out. If there's more, there's a few of them, and she'll put them on the front table. She'll do that. Tell your mom, pro tip.
Yeah, I'll give her a hint. Yeah.
Okay, I have to, before we get into this in a really good way, I have to ask you, you did Sugar Cane, an incredible Oscar-nominated documentary, and you did this book. Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
They were actually parallel the entire time, but technically the contract for We Survive the Night came first. So 5 years ago now, I wrote a proposal for what I imagined would be my first book. And then as I was starting to figure out how the heck to write a book, because I had never written a book, in May of 2021, 215 potential unmarked graves were found on the grounds of the Canim Lake Indian Residential School, one of the schools that my family was sent to. It's actually where my grandmother finished nursing in high school. My colleague, Emily Cassie, gave me a call. She sat next to me at my first and only real journalism job. It was at the Huffington Post between college and graduate school. And they didn't know what to do with me at the Huff Post, including like where to seat me in the newsroom. So they like plopped me in a desk next to Emily, who happens to be from Toronto and is Jewish. So she felt very moved to tell a story about the genocide that had happened right here, because her own people had experienced a genocide back in Europe. And she reached out to me because, I was the Indian guy who sat next to her at her first job. But no, actually, she had always, we kept in touch because we were like the same age, we were both, Canadian, we'd get lunch together, and so, she asked if I'd be open to collaborating with her on a documentary, and I had just signed the contract for this book, and I had no clue how to write a book, and I had never directed a film of any length, like not even a TikTok. And so I told her I had to think about it. And while I thought about it, she went full steam ahead and found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers and the Williams Lake First Nation, who was about to begin their own investigation at the residential school nearby, St. Joseph's Mission. And so when I called Em back and said, hey, about that documentary, I've been thinking about it and I'd be open to collaborating with you on that. 2 weeks had gone by, and she said, that's wonderful. I've identified this First Nation that's beginning its own search, and it's happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. And when she said that, I was like completely floored, because of course that was the school that my family was sent to, and where, to the best of my knowledge at the time, my father was born and found in at the time all I heard was that my father was born in Williams Lake and found in a dumpster. And so that combination of events, which, there was 139 of those schools across Canada. What is the likelihood that not only would Emily choose to focus our documentary on that school, what's the likelihood that I would be plopped at a desk next to her? What's the likelihood that in a New York newsroom I would be plopped at a desk next to a Canadian who would become a filmmaker? What's the likelihood that the son of the only known survivor of the incinerator at St. Joseph's Mission would become a journalist and a storyteller and then a filmmaker by accident? Like, all of it is just incredibly improbable. And I think that moment fundamentally transformed the rest of my life, probably, and transformed this book, because suddenly I was working on a project that was about, essentially a documentary that was about the system that nearly wiped our people's way of life off the face of this earth, which led me to ask in the book, very pointedly, what would it be for that way of life to come back to life on the page, in the way that I was choosing to tell the story. So that's the way that they sort of intertwine. You don't have to watch the movie to read the book. You have to read the book to watch the movie.
No. Why I wanted to ask about that is because they're two very different things. I thought they were two very different pieces of journalism and art, which is really interesting to me, because I also wrote a book for my family, The Women in My Family, and did a 4-part series, and they're also very different things. So I was curious too about your writing process. Were you like me? Do you write in like bathroom stalls on planes, and on your phone, and Or are you the Indian in the mountain who's at, at Banff, that's got the fellowship and everything else that we all aspire to be?
I write whenever I can get it in. My writing process for this, though, I guess I would back up a little bit and say that my writing process involved making a probably pretty unusual decision for, at the time, a 28-year-old who'd been living on the East Coast for the past decade of his life. And that was to move in with my old man. My dad is a major character in both Sugarcane and We Survived the Night. And that's because, I use the trickster coyote in this book as a sort of main storytelling thread, and because I see my father in lots of ways as an echo of the trickster coyote, and of course he is, because that was one of our first most prominent ancestors. And to write the book, I made a probably pretty unusual decision, which was, my dad left when I was 6 years old to chase Indian art world fame and alcohol. And I had seen him very sparingly in the decades since. And so I decided to move back into them. Because, you kind of got to go all the way there with your stories. I mean, you know that. And suddenly we were like living across the hallway from each other. And just to give you like a sense for the history here, he still owes me the money that I loaned him to come to my own high school graduation. We got a real history here. And so, we were sleeping across the hallway from each other, cooking each other breakfast. My dad's an artist, so he would be like out in the garage carving, listening to Led Zeppelin, taking rips from the bong, adzing away a log. Just as a total aside, visual artists, I feel very envious of their craft because it's way cooler than, just the process is way cooler than what we do. When my dad is out there making his art, it looks like a music video. And, I don't know what it's like when you write, but when I write, I'm hunched over a laptop with horrible posture. I'm complaining about my hips and my back, even though I'm too young to do that. And, nobody can talk to me because you have to be locked in to watch.
Oh, yes.
And so while I was living with my dad, I had this notion that began very small, which was that I was going to ornament the text essentially with little bits of oral history from my own people's culture. It did begin as a very small idea, and then I started reading these 100-year-plus-old anthropological texts that were full of our oral histories, and the largest body of them were the coyote stories. And just to be honest with you, I did have to read these because they're not really told by my own people anymore. I had only ever heard an uncle tell a coyote story once in my entire life, and he was there's no real artful way to put this in front of a room full of people, so I'm just going to say it. My grandfather had 19 children with 7 different women, and this was one of the ones who was over here. And so I was next to my dad, actually, at the Little Bit New Year's powwow when my grandfather introduced him to his older brother, Bucky. He was like, "Ed, this is your brother, Bucky." And I remember the look on my dad's face. He was just oh my God, because my dad thought he was the oldest brother for the time, the oldest kid. And turned out
Bucky take the horse? Is that the guy?
Yes, Bucky's the one who took the horse. And, of course,
Bucky won.
Pretty straightforward here. Bucky was a cowboy. And he was a damn good one, too, by the way. He had, the belt buckle has never been proven. He gave one to my dad, actually. It's one of the coolest things my dad owns. Anyways, so Bucky was the only one who I'd heard ever tell a coyote story. He's also the one who gave me the drum that I sung on today. But he passed away a few years ago from cancer, and I think that's a really accurate representation of where this art form lives and resides with my people, as it has nearly passed away. And so I was reading these coyote stories, and one day it just kind of clicked for me. In the PDF, because it was a PDF, I was reading about my trickster forefather, this, epic creator, destroyer, survivor, deadbeat dad, coyote. And then I was looking out at the garage, at my epic father, trickster, creator, destroyer, survivor, deadbeat dad. And then I was looking back at the PDF, and then I was looking out at the garage, and I was looking at the PDF. And it just clicked. I was like, oh my God, my father is the trickster coyote. And that insight fundamentally transformed the book, because it led me to ask a question that I hadn't seen asked before of this art form, which was, would it be possible to write an entire book that took the coyote story seriously as a source for nonfiction, wherein like one of the major threads and arguably the entire structure of the book is through the coyote story.
I love that. You know, you talked about a little bit about oral story and how, you know, before we wrote anything down, that's how we passed our stories down for thousands and thousands of years, was orally. And for a long time, when we would try to put oral story and oral history and dreams and things that our people see, like visions, into our writing as journalists, we were often told, what is that? Take that out, that's not fact, no. But it's a bold move, starting a nonfiction book like that.
Especially in America.
Yeah, especially in America, and you carried it forward. Like, I loved the beginning and reading about the coyote, and then I loved seeing the coyote again and again and again. You have to read the coyote stories, they're so incredible, and I was a bit reminded about Secwépemc. So Secwépemc is James Bay Coast, the Innu. Secwépemc is a trickster, and he does things that he shouldn't, and will do it anyway, and sees things, and that is how I began the knowing the same way. But I never thought about taking it through the whole book. That's super
You're
smart.
not as crazy as I am.
No, it's beautiful because the stories are the truth, right?
And what I came to see is, and I'd be curious if you see something similar about Secwépemc, is that, you know, the coyote stories are actually a really capacious tradition. This tradition gets at so many different things. I mean, firstly, it gets at like men like my dad and my grandfather and me, truthfully. But it also, you know, gets at major moments of environmental and cultural
Contact.
transformation.
We have contact stories. Yeah.
You know, here's one thing.
Disappearance of women. Like,
Yeah.
everything.
Here's one thing that I think the coyote stories, and this I think for the skeptics, demands to be taken seriously. So one of the most significant stories in the book, around which the book is structured, is Coyote stealing the salmon. So the story goes that Coyote gets tricked by his own son in our version and gets sent down this river because he tried to steal his son's wife. You know, what a coyote thing to do. And then he gets caught in this fish trap that's being operated by these two witches at the head of the river. And they're like these monopolists who are catching and keeping all the fish for themselves. What a bad thing to do, right? And so Coyote like sets about doing the coyote thing, which is he's going to break the fish trap and then lead the fish up the river, at which point he does, as I've said, uses them to try to marry into every single village along the river that'll happen, because that's just how he is. And what's really interesting about this story is that in the Secwépemc version of it, the Shuswap version of it, we situate that fish trap in the same place where Western scientists will tell you 11,000 years ago, there really was an ice dam that held up a series of glacial lakes across the interior of what is now British Columbia, Canada. And 11,000 years ago, that ice dam really did break in what they call a yokoyap. You all learned a new word today. It's an Icelandic word, yokoyap. That's the word for ice dam flood. That formed the present course of the Fraser River, which was then populated by the salmon. So in this oral history, there is a human memory of an event that is thousands of years older than the pyramids, than the Bible, that goes all the way back to the end of the last ice age. And to my mind, if this is a tradition that had the capability of remembering and passing on orally something that happened that long ago, and to pinpoint where it happened on the land, how can you not take that seriously as a source for nonfiction? And, you know, I think that that is part of, like, if this book is doing any sort of work in nonfiction as a discipline or in the humanities, I think one of the most important things it's probably doing is to insist that this tradition, which, by the way, is one of the most significant oral literatures in the history of humanity. I mean, it really does stretch across the western half of this continent, all the way from Central America to Western Canada. Like, that's one of the most large-ranging stories of a trickster that probably exists in the world. It demands to be taken seriously. And I went to a university where we had to study the great works of Western civilization as part of our curriculum. And would it have been so hard for them to put a 10-page, 5-page version of a coyote story on there? Like, we had to read like all 400 pages of the Iliad, you know, like I can tell you, I could tell you about the arguments that John Locke was making, but why can't my classmates tell you about Coyote Steals the Salmon? It's a whole story.
Absolutely. Consequently, I used to take English in this university that we're sitting in, and I actually flunked out of it because I just didn't understand. I couldn't get Northrop Frye. Oh my gosh, I'm going to shut down this spot here. And major British authors. I I couldn't understand it, and yeah, so I flunked out of English essentially.
One of my favorite things about the Coyote stories is that what they tell us is that culture is stolen. Is they tell us that sometimes our culture was taken from the supernatural, or, I don't know, I mean, maybe that's a good account for where culture really comes from.
I like that, and I would say that that would be absolutely true. Culture comes from many things. Culture comes from the stars in the sky, it comes from us, it comes from dreams, it comes from our stories, and it comes from dance.
And it comes from theft, man.
And it comes from theft. Okay, we're gonna get to that. So we're gonna get to that first. But first, I want to talk about your dancing because, okay, another story. I was at TIFF and I was watching this film. Nick Maloney was there too, and I was sitting there and I'm like, yeah, it was powwow people. It's this amazing film about a 3-day, right? Is it 3-day? It's daybreak. It's a daybreak.
It's a daybreak star in Seattle, yeah.
Yeah.
Sky Hapinka. It was actually a really interesting process to think about just from a filmmaking standpoint. You're a filmmaker, so he put on the powwow so that he could film it. It wasn't.
Oh, I thought the powwow was already happening.
No,
he just happened to do
put
it.
on the powwow.
Oh,
that was
okay.
Super, I was so
Okay.
curious. I still haven't seen it, but I'm so
You
curious.
haven't seen it? I think I texted you in it. I'm like,
No,
are
I
you
didn't
in
have
this?
the
I think
cameo.
because I saw you in it before I knew you were in it at the end. I'm like, I know that guy. Yeah. And I'm sorry you didn't win.
I did not win. I did make it to the semifinals.
Of course, no
You know what the
worries.
funny part is though? They had a thank you. Auntie was proud. Auntie was like, go nephew! Yeah, they had a contest the day before to get people to come, and I did win that one. And that's not the one that made it in the movie, but you know, I won the powwow and Sugar King though, so I'll always be able to show that my grandkids someday will be like, look, grandson, look, your grandpa really did win that powwow.
But dance to you brought you back. It gave you something. Learning how to dance, be a traditional man's dancer. And you write about this in the book so beautifully. And it is throughout your book because it seems like it's very much a part of who you are. And when you grow up too, as we do in First Nations households that are also mixed race. My dad was Polish. Your mom, Ukrainian and Irish, I think? Or something?
Irish and Jewish,
Okay,
yeah,
Irish
she's
and-
very
yeah.
New York.
So, you know, you always never feel like, you know, you write and, you know, I hate this expression, but you use it and I use it, and it's like, you know, you walk in two different worlds often, but you never really feel sometimes that you belong anywhere, right? And so dancing, though, it gave you something.
Yeah, so I started dancing when I was a kid. After my father left, my mom did a lot of things to help keep me connected. You know, I think it's obviously like it's a nonfiction book, so everything there is true. But like, I just think that sometimes maybe there are so many examples of white people behaving badly in literature and stuff. And you know, I think it's kind of nice to, at least in this book, to have an example of a white mom who did the right thing. In fact, actually, Cheyenne and I were on Cheyenne Marie Sage is here. She's an author. She has a book called Soft as Bones. We were on a panel in Portland the other day, and I made a joke because the white lady who was walking us to our panel was named Karen. And so I was like, "You're giving Karens a great name," and she did. She was really nice, and she was lovely. And like, you know, we do need more of that. Like, I'm sorry, like I'm just gonna say we need more examples of that, especially nowadays. And so, you know, my mom was a white woman who had really good instincts as a mom. She realized that she had this little native boy who, if you took a family photo of me, my dad, and my mom, like, it would look like my dad's jeans kicked my mom's jeans ass. Like, you know, I came out looking the way I looked, and they stuck about as Indian a name on me as they could stick on a kid, like Julian Brave NoiseCat. Nobody read that name in school attendance and was like, what's your racial background? And my dad on top of all that was like, you know, this is a kind of contradictory in terms, but like he was a famous Indian artist. Like I remember when I was a kid, he was pictured on the cover of Native People's magazine with like a backwards tangle hat and purple rock star shades. Like he really was like a figure. And so when I showed
That's
up,
a hottie.
yeah, Mike. Wow, you're the second auntie to say that. You can't say that. This is being recorded. Yeah, so you know he and when I would show up and I'd tell people my last name is NoiseCat, it's actually a pretty uncommon last name. There's only like 3 or 4 of us in the world. People would go, oh, like Ed Archie NoiseCat, and I'd be like, yeah, like you know, that's my dad. He's not around anymore. So it was this thing, and my mom was really smart about, you know, she would bring me home to Canim Lake, which is over 1,000 miles in a country away from Oakland, California, where I grew up. We would often drive, which is over 24 hours in the car. She brought me down to the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, California, one of the oldest urban Indian community centers in the country. She even learned how to bead, so I could have my own powwow radio. And when I was down at the Intertribal Friendship House, they would have powwow drum and dance practice on Thursday nights. Back then, now it's on Wednesday nights. And you know, I, for the first couple years, was like all the other kids, like mostly really scared of going out there and dancing. Because it's a scary thing, you know, you're a little kid, you don't want to go out there and dance in front of everybody, and like also, if you were like me, which turns out like almost all kids deal with this, even if they have 2 Native parents, you know, like you didn't feel like you were necessarily Indian enough to go out there and like, you know, act like you were trapping an elk on the broken, you know, Friendship Center, like tiling. You know, that's what it is to be Native. You like act like you're tracking the buffalo through the, you know, the inner city streets of Oakland, California. And that's how you learn how to traditional dance. And
Even if you fish, you don't.
even if your people are fishermen, we were fishermen, not buffalo hunters. That's mostly
It's so funny, I love them.
Just representative. So you know that was a big thing for me, and it became a huge part, and remains a huge part of who I am and what I do. In fact, it was actually the first way that I started traveling around Indian country. When I was in college, and before that, I would travel the powwow circuit in the summer, and you know, I was good enough that I would win, and that would be enough to put gas in the car and to, you know, get to the next powwow, maybe get a room. One time I did win a horse, and it turns out that the horses that you win at powwows, it's not Seabiscuit that they're giving away.
Oh my God, this part I couldn't believe this in the book.
Okay, so this is a dark turn of the story. So I'll say the positive story first, and then I'll say the negative part of the story. So the positive turn of the story, my publicist is growing, she knows going to this one. The positive story is actually became a writer because of powwow in a sense. I got my first paid writing gig, was a column for Indian Country Today called Powwow Reflections. So when I was traveling the powwow circuit, one of the editors over there who I knew from being in college and stuff was like, hey, would you want to write about this for us? So I wrote a very short-lived column. It was like literally 3 or 4 editions of this column. But it was the first time I got paid to write, and so that was my entry point to writing. The sad part of the story is that me and my Uncle Bucky, the cowboy, went and picked up the horse, my horse, his name's Brando, from this guy named Peter Joe Anthony, who's from, what's that lake called? Not Alkali Lake, Adams Lake. And you know, we brought it back to the pavilion where my uncle lived and kept his horses. And there's no real good way to say it. So the horse was no good, right? We tried to break it, and it wasn't breakable. And my uncle was a cowboy in full sense, and he didn't have no time for no good horse. And without telling me, important point in the story. If you leave tonight, you have to remember this part. I did not tell me he was going to do this, okay? But he sold the horse to the glue factory. And yeah, that was the end of Brando. So that's my triumphant Indian wins a horse at a powwow story.
But it's, you know what though?
I'm glad you could all laugh about it though.
No, we'll put tobacco down. Your horse, we all.
I named him Brando because of Marlon Brando, you know, because you know he stood up for Indian rights.
You said, okay, and I've been told that I've run out of time, but I just have to say that you said that the book was an honor song for your dad. But I just wanted to say when I was reading the book, I thought the whole book was an honor song to your family. And like what I was saying too about how when we write in circles, right? Lee Miracle was the one that told me that after she read some of my books, or my first book. She said, you know, you're doing that thing, and you're doing that thing too. Because you were writing about Zeke. You were writing about, you know, your great-great-grandfather, which I loved, and your great-great-grandma, because I thought I was the one that did that, and I'm glad to see you did it too. It's because, you know, we also too have our children when we're like young, especially way back then, so you often had your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents. Like, you'd had it for a long time in your life, right? But it was an ode to your entire family, to me, and it was a true... it was about Indian families. This is what our families, that's what they look like, you know?
Yeah, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's a book that gets into some real stuff and some hard, you know, elements. I mean, we are talking about Indians here. They did try to kill us all, or at least our cultures. And at the same time, you know, I think that it's a celebration of not just our survival, but our way of life. You know, I think that the entire project of colonization is premised on this idea that Indian life was bad and backwards, and that progress was making it die and go away. And I think across, you know, my work, across your work, all of our work, we are saying that that is the exact opposite of that. That our way of life was good and beautiful, and that it actually has something to lend not just to us still to this day, but to a broader humanity. You know, I think I look out at the world and I see people, you know, searching for meaning, searching for connection, and it just so happens that like our ways, you know, have a lot of meaning in them and give us a lot of connection to each other, to our relatives.
You don't have to do that mindfulness thing.
To our land.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that that's a really beautiful, beautiful thing. And also, you know, it always mystifies me when people don't want to engage with Indigenous stories, because like, set aside like the social issues and like the things that you can learn from it, from a pure like entertainment value perspective, like if you just sit down in any res living room across this continent and listen to the aunties and the uncles tell stories for like a couple hours, you're going to hear some of the most outrageous, hilarious, tragic, raunchy, just like wild stories that you've ever heard in your entire life. And from a pure like, what is a good story perspective, it makes no sense to me that people wouldn't want to engage with that. Like set culture and politics aside, like just like pay attention to our stuff, because I don't know, like my people, your people too, we used to have to sit in a pit house for like many months on end with no phone, no screens, no TV, no nothing. It was freezing cold outside. There was snow everywhere. What do you think we did all the time? You know, that's why we're so good at banter. That's why we're so good at telling stories. We've been doing it for like thousands and thousands of years. And by the way, the fact that the stories are good and entertaining, that's part of how we maintained our way of life. If the story was a lecture, that's why the coyote stories are so slapstick, why there's so much humor in them, why they're so memorable, because if they were forgettable, then our way of life would have died. But they're not. And I don't know, I just hope that people continue to see that and want to engage in our work, you know, for those reasons, in addition to like the good intellectual ones.
The book is really, it's so beautiful, it's a triumph. You did an incredible job of weaving all the elements together, and I think Coyote would be proud.
Don't get them too high.
Okay, oh, good. So this is the point where we're going to ask you if you have any questions for Julian. And there's a microphone that will go around. Do not be shy. If there's something you want to ask, just raise your hand. Sometimes we stun people into silence.
Hi again. I just wanted to ask, in your book, since it's very family-oriented, how did you convince your family to have such like a intimate like insight for everyone to read, like to give us access to their lives? How do you convince your family to be part of that experience?
Yeah, you know, they say that one of the worst things in a family is to have a writer in it. And so, you know, it terrifies me, the fact that so much of my story and my family's story is in my work. But I also think that there's no other way to do this kind of work. You either commit to telling the story or you don't tell the story. And I really went through this, especially with the documentary Sugarcane, which has been viewed by something like 2 million people now, which is a lot of people to, I try not to think about that. You know, I'm just really grateful that my family, on some level, understood what I was trying to do, and that they understand, because I think that's part of our way, that you can tell hard and complicated stories about people and still love them, and that like the act of telling a story itself is, in our tradition, an act of love. You know, the way that I've seen people sit around and tell stories about each other, it's often, unfortunately, at like a funeral or something like that, but like when you're telling a story that is complicated, but it also has wonderful parts and hilarious parts and hard parts, like the act of telling the story itself is saying, I knew this person so well that we shared this life together, and this story is a sign that I'm the only one who can tell it, and it's a sign of my love for the person I'm telling the story about before. And so I see myself as part of that tradition. I think they have understood that, and it's been really cool to see the way that they've supported Sugarcane. And like over the last few weeks, I've been getting a lot of photos of like my relatives, like media consoles in their trucks, with them listening to the audiobook, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
Coming.
Thank you. You were talking about identifying the coyote in your life, where it was. But in that process, I was wondering how you were feeling about it, because just to relate my coyote experience, so over the last year I've had coyotes show up at my house when I'm like out having a smoke at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And then in my job, I was working with a situation with coyotes in Liberty Village for months. So this reoccurring theme in my life had been happening for months and months and months. And I know I was feeling that it was taking me down a trail to explore my Indigenous self more. So I was curious, when you were going through that process, how are you feeling about it and getting to the identification? Because I feel there's a purpose that happened to me here that I'm still trying to distill the message from. So I thought it'd be a nice place to get some insight on that.
Yeah, so firstly, in our tradition, coyote is, sometimes he's like the coyote, but more often he's a shapeshifter, so you never know when he's going to show up and what he's going to look like. So for example, when Simon Fraser showed up on our roaring salmon river and announced his intention to use it to get to the Pacific Ocean, we were like, coyote, because that was a crazy ass thing to do. And by the way, like we tried to dissuade him from doing it, and he almost died the way that we told him that he was going to die. But he survived, because maybe he was coyote. And my whole take on this is we should just rename the whole river to the Coyote River, and we should rename the university to Coyote University. But I think that there's a lot in these stories. First of all, they get at a lot of different things, and so and that's part of why it was such a wide-ranging, widely told set of stories, because it's not just about one dimension of our life. It can get at the way that our men are. It can get at environmental and cultural history. It can get at survival. It can get at questions of like, why does change happen in the world? What is change? It can get pretty philosophical, and also it can just be like, a good story that you tell in the middle of the winter. And so, I think the one thing that I tried to do was, because I retell these stories in the present, which is to say that I'm not like a stenographer for the oral histories as they were written down. I myself am making storytelling choices. So for example, in the story about the coyote getting caught in the fish trap by the two monopolist witches, in various versions of that oral history that I was reading, the witches had different identities. So sometimes they were sisters, sometimes they were witches, sometimes they were these two birds. And so I kind of figured like, oh, there's like debate among my ancestors about the identities, which is so, it's fair game to make them whatever fits the story in this present day. And so in my version, they're two lesbians who are in the middle of a debate about their polyamorous relationship when Coyote shows up as a driftwood log in their fish trap. And I feel like that's fair because, you know, like this tradition, it needs to continue to live. That's part of what I'm also trying to suggest in my work. Like this tradition there were core parts of it that needed to be passed down. It's very clear that that's true. Like, you know, for example, the Coyote stealing the salmon story, there's a very basic message in there, which is don't catch all the fish. Which, by the way, like colonial commercial fisheries, they've gotten that went wrong everywhere around the world. So it's a very important message. There's also a message there about interrelation and how all of us people on the river are all actually related to each other, which is true. And, you know, those things need to be preserved, but at the same time, the tradition needed to be enlivened and made relevant to the current moment. That's what makes a tradition a tradition. It's not that it just stays the same, it's also that it remains relevant in the moment that it's being told. And so that meant that each generation of storytellers would be pulling forward and pushing back different details in the narrative for whatever was most important for, you know, their family, their community, their audience in that particular moment. So in this particular moment, you know, I think that the Coyote stories are relevant because of the major environmental and cultural transformations that we're undergoing right now. You know, the Coyote stories were about, you know, in some instances, for example, the end of the last ice age. Well, they can be very relevant to transformations that are happening right now with climate change. They might be very relevant for understanding our political scene, which is full of tricksters, you know, and their tricks. They might be relevant for understanding other elements of our culture, which, you know, one of the insights from the Coyote and the trickster stories is that culture is sometimes a stolen thing, which, I don't know, seems pretty true to me. And so for all those reasons, I think that this tradition, the way I try to think about it is like how can it has to be relevant to me today because it's about my ancestors, it's about me. So how do I find ways to continue to show the present moment and then the next moment that it remains this alive, you know, tradition? Of course, like there's a reason our people pass these stories down.
I just wanted to say a special thank you to you and so many Indigenous artists, writers, because coming from other cultures, what we have done, even when we have the stories oral, we kept it internal because we didn't want white people to judge us. So we end up with this suppression for a long time, and we're older now, just beginning to follow in your footsteps of celebrating, but that fear of judgment. So my question is, did you have any of that, or culturally you've passed that, so now you're just very comfortable telling stories?
I would say that, like, just in my assessment of having been to a lot of Indigenous communities across North America, different peoples have different dispositions to how much they're willing to share with outsiders and others. And one way in which the residential school story has not been told, which is that I think it's very interesting that the Kamloops Indian Residential School, as well as St. Joseph's Mission, are both schools that exist within the territory of my people, the Secwépemc people. And I think that there is just something about our disposition towards the world that is just more open and sharing about our history and our culture. You know, when Simon Fraser showed up on our roaring salmon river, one of our chiefs, this guy named Clefusim, was like, well, that's a foolish idea, but I'm gonna get on my horse and ride to the next village so that they don't kill you on sight. You know, I think we've just always had that kind of a disposition towards outsiders. We're just a more open and inviting people, which is, you know, in certain moments probably not served us the best. It's probably part of why we were so close to the Catholic Church, for example, which turned out maybe not to be a great thing. But in other ways, I think it has been part of why we've been willing to share this history and these experiences with the broader world in a way that I think other people, like for example our neighbors, the Chilcotin, our ancestral enemies, they have a much more closed down relationship about sharing this history and their culture with outsiders. And you know, that's their way, and I totally respect that. And similarly, if you go, you know, downriver to the coast Salish, like their winter stuff, you don't talk about that, you know. And similarly, other parts of Indian country, the Pueblos, etc., they have a much more secretive relationship to their culture and their ceremonies. And I think that totally makes sense in different contexts, and I also know that in my own people's context, we are a little bit different about that stuff.
I could add a little bit to that. Judgment is a difficult thing, especially for decades. The Indian Act outlawed our ceremonies, outlawed our gatherings, took away potlatch. And that was for very long periods of time. We had to go underground. We didn't see ourselves represented in curriculum. We didn't see ourselves represented in the school system. So we, Maurice Sinclair often said this, you didn't feel like you belonged, you didn't feel like you were worthy, you didn't matter, we didn't matter as much as everybody else. So I get what you're saying about that, and like with judgment too. And I think that we've always had writers who have written our stories, but Canada hasn't listened. America hasn't listened. Nobody bought Lee Merrill's books for decades, right? They were banned. A lot of Indigenous authors were banned, were not read. It's only been lately that things have changed. So, you don't care about judgment, but people judged, and then the law judged. But now it's different-ish. Ish.
For now.
For now, it's different-ish for now. And then you have this beautiful, look at the youth that are coming up. I've said that a few times, like Julian, Chan right there in her book. There's so much that's out there that is so inspiring and unafraid. Not like our generation.
Oh, Auntie's got a question up here.
Auntie, last one, I'm getting the look.
Bonjour. I'm actually maybe going to be an anti-fan too. No, I was telling him when he sat here, I don't know who you are, so we're Googling you. No, we flew in from Thunder Bay. I come from a northern community called Fort Hope, which is on north of Nippigan, if you know where Thunder Bay and Nippigan Lake is. Anyway, I'm just so reminded of so many stories that my grandma shared, and they were Dibajmoinan. That's what we call stories in my language, and Atsokanan are legends in our language. So she knew Windigo as a trickster and shared those with us, and Nanabuju and Wiskejak. Those are the three common ones that she would tell, and they're like, because Wiskejak is more the trickster in Manitoba area, but we're pretty much, I guess people travel just along rivers and told their stories. So, what was my point in saying all that? No, I guess my question would be, what do you call stories or in your language? Because I don't think I've ever heard of it. And do you guys use also legends?
Yes.
Legends as with coyote as well?
Yeah, so we have two kinds of, in our language, we have two different terms for the different types of narrative. A l'chaim is the kind of narrative that it's an ancestral narrative or something that you've observed in your own life, l'chaim. And then the word that we use for like supernatural events, like the coyote stories or like ancient stories, is Secwépemc, which is kind of translates as legends, but it's kind of not a perfect translation. And my understanding is that all our neighbors have very similar words and a similar kind of understanding of the different types of narratives. The l'chaim being, stories of your own life or your ancestors' lives that were, passed down and you were supposed to know. And then the Secwépemc were like the stories of Secwépemc, the coyote, or Deltkukri, the creator, other transformers, those sorts of things.
Good question.
Our thanks to Julian and Tanya for sharing their time with us, their experiences, their humor, and for reminding us just how powerful and transformative storytelling in all its forms can be. Julian and Tanya, a round of appreciation.